Neoplatonism is a modern term used to designate a tradition of philosophy that arose in the 3rd century AD and persisted until shortly after the closing of the Platonic Academy in Athens in AD 529 by Justinian I. Neoplatonists were heavily influenced by Plato, but also by the Platonic tradition that thrived during the 6th centuries, which separated the first of the Neoplatonists from Plato. In defining the term Neoplatonism, it is difficult to reduce the school of thought to a concise set of ideas that all Neoplatonic philosophers shared in common. The work of Neoplatonic philosophy involved describing the derivation of the whole of reality from a single principle, the One. While the Neoplatonists generally shared some basic assumptions about the nature of reality, there were also considerable differences in their views and approaches, and so it can be difficult to summarize the philosophical content of Neoplatonism briefly. Instead, the most concise definition of Neoplatonism casts it as an historical term. It refers to the dynamic philosophical tradition that Neoplatonism was over the course of its history, to the work of Plotinus, who is traditionally identified as the founder of Neoplatonism, and to the many thinkers after him, who developed, responded to and criticized his ideas. There are multiple ways to categorize the differences between the Neoplatonists according to their differing views. But one way counts 3 distinct phases in Neoplatonism after Plotinus: the work of his student Porphyry, that of Iamblichus in his school in Chalcis, and the period in the 5th and 6th centuries, when the academies in Alexandria and Athens flourished. Thinkers of this final period include Syrianus, Olympiodorus the Younger, Proclus and Damascius. An important feature that distinguishes Neoplatonism after Porphyry from earlier periods is that later Neoplatonists embraced a certain kind of spiritual exercise, called theurgy, as a means of developing the soul through a process called kenosis. Neoplatonism has been very influential throughout history. In the Middle Ages, Neoplatonic ideas were integrated into the philosophical and theological works of many of the most important medieval Islamic, Christian, and Jewish thinkers. In Muslim lands, Neoplatonic texts were available in Persian and Arabic translations, and notable thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Avicenna and Moses Maimonides incorporated Neoplatonic elements into their own thinking. Although the revitalization of Neoplatonism amongst Italian Renaissance thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola is perhaps more famous, Latin translations of late ancient Neoplatonic texts were first available in the Christian West much earlier, in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, had direct access to works by Proclus, Simplicius and Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, and he knew about other Neoplatonists, such as Plotinus and Porphyry, through second-hand sources. The influence of Neoplatonism also extends into forms of culture beyond philosophy, and well into the modern era, for instance, in Renaissance aesthetics, and in the work of modernist poets such as W. B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, among many more. Origins of the term Neoplatonism. The term Neoplatonism has a double function as a historical category. On the one hand, it differentiates the philosophical doctrines of Plotinus and his successors from those of the historical Plato. On the other, the term makes an assumption about the novelty of Plotinus' interpretation of Plato. In the nearly 6 centuries from Plato's time to Plotinus, there had been an uninterrupted tradition of interpreting Plato which had begun with Aristotle and with the immediate successors of Plato's Academy, and continued on through a period of Platonism which is now referred to as Middle Platonism. The term Neoplatonism implies that Plotinus' interpretation of Plato was so distinct from those of his predecessors that it should be thought to introduce a new period in the history of Platonism. Some contemporary scholars, however, have taken issue with this assumption and have doubted that Neoplatonism constitutes a useful label. They claim that merely marginal differences separate Plotinus' teachings from those of his immediate predecessors. Whether Neoplatonism is a meaningful or useful historical category is itself a central question concerning the history of the interpretation of Plato. For much of the history of Platonism, it was commonly accepted that the doctrines of the Neoplatonists were essentially the same as those of Plato. The Renaissance Platonist Marsilio Ficino, for instance, thought that the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato was an authentic and accurate representation of Plato's philosophy. Although it is unclear precisely when scholars began to disassociate the philosophy of the historical Plato from the philosophy of his Neoplatonic interpreters, they had clearly begun to do so at least as early as the first decade of the 19th century. Contemporary scholars often identify the German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher as an early thinker who took Plato's philosophy to be separate from that of his Neoplatonic interpreters. However, others have argued that the differentiation of Plato from Neoplatonism was the result of a protracted historical development that preceded Schleiermacher's scholarly work on Plato. Origins. The most important forerunners of Neoplatonism are the Middle Platonists, such as Plutarch, and the Neo-Pythagoreans, especially Numenus of Apamea. Philo, a forerunner of Neoplatonism, translated Judaism into terms of Stoic, Platonic and Neo-Pythagorean elements, and held that God is super-rational and can be reached only through ecstasy. And Philo held that the oracles of God supply the material of moral and religious knowledge. The earliest Christian philosophers, such as Justin and Athenagoras, who attempted to connect Christianity with Platonism, and the Christian Gnostics of Alexandria, especially Valentinus and the followers of Basilides, also mirrored elements of Neoplatonism, albeit without its rigorous self-consistency. Teachings. Neoplatonism is generally a metaphysical and epistemological philosophy. Neoplatonism is a form of idealistic monism combined with elements of polytheism. Although the founder of Neoplatonism is supposed to have been Ammonius Saccas, the Enneads of his pupil Plotinus are the primary and classical document of Neoplatonism. As a form of mysticism, it contains theoretical and practical parts. The first dealing with the high origin of the human soul and showing how it has departed from its first estate, and the second showing the way by which the soul may again return to the eternal and supreme. The system can be divided between the invisible world and the phenomenal world, the former containing the transcendent one from which emanates an eternal, perfect essence, which, in turn, produces the world soul. The one of the characteristic features of Plotinus' system, which was also taken up by subsequent Neoplatonists, is the doctrine of the one, beyond being. For Plotinus, the first principle of reality is an utterly simple, ineffable, unknowable subsistence which is both the creative source and the teleological end of all existing things. Although, properly speaking, there is no name appropriate for the first principle, the most adequate names are the One or the Good. The One is so simple that it cannot even be said to exist or to be a being. Rather, the creative principle of all things is beyond being, a notion which is derived from Book V of the Republic, when, in the course of his famous analogy of the sun, Plato says that the good is beyond being in power and dignity. In Plotinus' model of reality, the one is the cause of the rest of reality, which takes the form of two subsequent hypostases, nous and soul. Although Neoplatonists after Plotinus adhered to his cosmological scheme in its most general outline, later developments in the tradition also departed substantively from Plotinus' teachings in regards to significant philosophical issues, such as the nature of evil. Demiurge or nous. The original being initially emanates, or throws out, the nous, which is a perfect image of the one and the archetype of all existing things. It is simultaneously both being and thought, idea and ideal world. As image, the nous corresponds perfectly to the one, but as derivative, it is entirely different. What Plotinus understands by the nous is the highest sphere accessible to the human mind, while all also being pure intellect itself. Nous is the most critical component of idealism, Neoplatonism being a pure form of idealism. The demiurge is the energy, or ergon, which manifests or organizes the material world into perceivability. The world soul, the image and product of the motionless nous, is the world soul, which, according to Plotinus, is immaterial like the nous. Its relation to the nous is the same as that of the nous to the one. It stands between the nous and the phenomenal world, and it is permeated and illuminated by the former, but it is also in contact with the latter. The nous spirit is indivisible. The world soul may preserve its unity and remain in the nous, but, at the same time, it has the power of uniting with the corporeal world and thus being disintegrated. It therefore occupies an intermediate position. As a single world soul, it belongs in essence and destination to the intelligible world, but it also embraces innumerable individual souls, and these can either allow themselves to be informed by the nous, or turn aside from the nous and choose the phenomenal world and lose themselves in the realm of the senses and the finite. The phenomenal world, the soul, as a moving essence, generates the corporeal or phenomenal world. This world ought to be so pervaded by the soul that its various parts should remain in perfect harmony. Plotinus is no dualist in the same sense as sects like the Gnostics. In contrast, he admires the beauty and splendor of the world. So long as idea governs matter, or the soul governs the body, the world is fair and good. It is an image, though a shadowy image, of the upper world, and the degrees of better and worse in it are essential to the harmony of the whole. But, in the actual phenomenal world, unity and harmony are replaced by strife or discord. The result is a conflict, a becoming and vanishing, an elusive existence. And the reason for this state of things is that bodies rest on a substratum of matter. Matter is the indeterminate, that with no qualities. If destitute of form and idea, it is evil. As capable of form, it is neutral. Evil here is understood as a parasite, having no existence of its own, and unavoidable outcome of the universe, having an other necessity, as a harmonizing factor. Practice here. Then, we enter upon the practical philosophy. Along the same road by which it descended, the soul must retrace its steps back to the supreme good. It must first of all return to itself. This is accomplished by the practice of virtue, which aims at likeness to God, and leads up to God. In the ethics of Plotinus, all the older schemes of virtue are taken over and arranged in a graduated series. The lowest stage is that of the civil virtues, then follow the purifying, and last of all the divine virtues. The civil virtues merely adorn the life, without elevating the soul. That is the office of the purifying virtues, by which the soul is freed from sensuality and led back to itself, and thence to the nous. By means of ascetic observances, the human becomes once more a spiritual and enduring being, free from all sin. But there is still a higher attainment. It is not enough to be sinless, one must become God. This is reached through contemplation of the primeval being, the One, in other words, through an ecstatic approach to it. Thought cannot attain to this, for thought reaches only to the nous, and it itself is a kind of motion. It is only in a state of perfect passivity and repose that the soul can recognize and touch the primeval being. Hence, the soul must first pass through a spiritual curriculum, beginning with the contemplation of corporeal things in their multiplicity and harmony. It then retires upon itself and withdraws into the depths of its own being, rising thence to the nous, the world of ideas. But, even there, it does not find the highest, the one. It still hears a voice saying, "Not we have made ourselves." The last stage is reached when, in the highest tension and concentration, beholding in silence and utter forgetfulness of all things, it is able, as it were, to lose itself. Then it sees God, the foundation of life, the source of being, the origin of all good, the root of the soul. In that moment, it enjoys the highest indescribable bliss. It is, as it were, swallowed up by divinity, bathed in the light of eternity. Porphyry says that on 4 occasions during the 6 years of their acquaintance, Plotinus attained to this ecstatic union with God. Celestial hierarchy. The religious philosophy of Plotinus for himself personally sufficed, without the aid of the popular religion or worship. Nevertheless, he sought for points of support in these. God is certainly in the truest sense nothing but the primeval being who is revealed in a variety of emanations and manifestations. Plotinus taught the existence of an ineffable and transcendent One, the All, from which emanated the rest of the universe as a sequence of lesser beings. Later Neoplatonic philosophers, especially Iamblichus, added hundreds of intermediate beings such as gods, angels, demons, and other beings as mediators between the One and humanity. The Neoplatonist gods are omniperfect beings and do not display the usual amoral behavior associated with their representations in the myths. The one God, the good, transcendent and ineffable. The hypercosmic gods, those that make essence, life, and soul. The demiurge, the creator. The cosmic gods, those who make being, nature, and matter, including the gods known to us from classical religion. Salvation. Neoplatonists believed human perfection and happiness were attainable in this world, without awaiting an afterlife. Perfection and happiness, seen as synonymous, could be achieved through philosophical contemplation. They did not believe in an independent existence of evil. They compared it to darkness, which does not exist in itself but only as the absence of light. So, too, evil is simply the absence of good. Things are good insofar as they exist. They are evil only insofar as they are imperfect, lacking some good which they should have. It is also a cornerstone of Neoplatonism to teach that all people return to the source. The source, absolute, or one, is what all things spring from. Then, as a superconsciousness, is where all things return. It can be said that all consciousness is wiped clean and is returned to a blank slate when returning to the source. All things have force or potential as their essence. This dynamis begets energy. The Neoplatonists believed in the pre-existence and immortality of the soul. The human soul consists of a lower irrational soul and a higher rational soul, both of which can be regarded as different powers of the one soul. It was widely held that the soul possesses a vehicle, accounting for the human soul's immortality and allowing for its return to the one after death. After bodily death, the soul takes up a level in the afterlife corresponding with the level at which it lived during its earthly life. The Neoplatonists believed in the principle of reincarnation. Although the most pure and holy souls would dwell in the highest regions, the impure soul would undergo a purification before descending again, to be reincarnated into a new body, perhaps into animal form. Plotinus believed that a soul may be reincarnated into another human or even a different sort of animal. However, Porphyry maintained, instead, that human souls were only reincarnated into other humans. A soul which has returned to the One achieves union with the cosmic universal soul and does not descend again, at least, not in this world period. Logos. The term, logos, was interpreted variously in Neoplatonism. Plotinus refers to Thales in interpreting logos as the principle of meditation, the interrelationship between the hypostases and the One. St. John introduces a relation between logos and the Son, Christ, whereas St. Paul calls it Son, image, and form. Victorinus subsequently differentiated the logos interior to God from the logos related to the world by creation and salvation. Augustine reinterpreted Aristotle and Plato in the light of early Christian thought. In his Confessions, he describes the logos as the divine eternal Word. Following St. John, Augustine's logos took on flesh in Christ, in whom the logos was present as in no other man. He strongly influenced early medieval Christian philosophy. Perhaps the key subject in this was logos. After Plotinus and his student Porphyry, Aristotle's works entered the curriculum of Platonic thought. Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's Categoria was important as an introduction to logic, and the study of Aristotle became an introduction to the study of Plato in the late Platonism of Athens and Alexandria. The commentaries of this group seek to harmonize Plato, Aristotle, and, often, the Stoa. Some works of Neoplatonism were attributed to Plato or Aristotle. De Mundo, for instance, is thought not to be the work of a pseudo-Aristotle, though this remains debatable.